What is happening, guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome back to another video. It pains me every time I have to hear that sound and watch that video. It's just something that you never ever want to have to see. Here we are looking at my 2016 340 with my 2020 240 B58 engine. So yes, you guys, this video is a long time coming. I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what happened to the motor. Was it rod knock? Was it piston slap? Was there any internal failure? Why did it happen? Today I have a few more answers for you guys, and we can finally put the majority of this to rest. And believe it or not, it all comes down to this little piece in this bag. To think that all of that happened, all because of this little guy. It's wild. So just to recap really quick, you guys saw what had happened to the engine. It definitely sounded like rod knock. Before we actually heard the rod knock, we had the car sitting at idle. We moved it over to the dyno, started moving the car on the dyno, and we started to hear this like little metal sound trickling around, almost like it was making its way through the head. It almost sounded exactly like this little guy. So we did hear the reverberation of this little piece of metal kind of making its way through the head. So we turned the car off right away. We thought maybe that the fan was hitting something. Looked around, everything seemed clear, start the car back up. And remind you, this only started happening after we started rolling the car on the dyno. Our first guess was that, the car had been previously beat on. As you guys know, when I bought this car, it already had a downpipe on it. It was already tuned. So we knew that the car had a history of being at least driven hard. I mean, if you tune a car and you put a downpipe on it, it's probably not gonna be babying around the car. So after a while, I had a little more time to get into the old engine and see what actually happened. I wanted to take this thing apart. Now, what we first wanted to look at were the rod bearings. We had suspicions that maybe it had spun a bearing at one point and the owner had put new rod bearings in and then used a thicker oil to mask the actual condition of the engine. Now, when you do something like that, the car will obviously run, but it's almost like a ticking time bomb. It's only a matter of time before something actually does fail. So I started pulling apart the motor, and the first place we were gonna start with were the rod bearings. We wanted to see what the rod bearings looked like, were they new, what were the tolerances like. We went through everything. Tolerances on all of the rod bearings were completely fine. Within spec, the bearings looked really, really good, almost newish. That was a little bit concerning, but we didn't quite have enough evidence to say that, okay, someone had put in new rod bearings and ran a thicker oil to just mask some of the other issues. After we checked all the rod bearings, I decided to come back another day and we started pulling apart some other things that I was a little bit suspect of. One being the oil pump. I had read in a couple of forums that some people with the B58 Gen 1 engines had failing plastic internals on the oil pump. Inside of the oil pump, there is a plastic housing that is being used. In some circumstances, those can fail if it's very cold and brittle. One thing that we did find is one of the pieces on the other side of the oil pump actually had cracked off. We probably were losing a bit of oil pressure through there. As soon as we saw that, we thought, okay, maybe we lost oil pressure and the high pressure fuel fuel pump wasn't getting enough pressure, so it started making a lot of noise. Now, sometimes with these engines, when one thing makes noise, it can reverberate through the engine, create a whole ton of noise that might sound like something else. It can be very deceiving when you start hearing noises in engines. But even with that cracked little piece on the oil pump, I still was not convinced that that was the cause or failure of the engine. So the next thing I said is we gotta take this head off. We have to see what the head looks like, see what the valves look like, see what the pistons look like. So today we removed the head. And cylinder three was not in good shape. And what we found was this little guy. As soon as we pulled the head off, I was able to flick it off and this little metal guy came right out. Now, if you look inside of cylinder 3 on top of the piston, you'll see the indentation of this thing. This little guy just got smashed in between the piston and the head. Question is, what is this? We don't really know. It's just a tiny piece of metal and it could have been from many things. If we use the new engine here, for display purposes, somehow this man, whether he came from an internal failing part, whether he was dropped in there accidentally, we don't know. But somehow this little guy made his way all the way through the intake manifold, or maybe it was already something in here that failed, into the head, through the valves, and on top of the piston. Now, after all of this happened and we pulled the turbo, the propellers were completely fine. They weren't damaged. If something had passed through those propellers, it would have damaged the turbo propellers, especially a little piece of metal like that. We would have seen some sort of damage on the propeller fin, but the propeller fins were fine and they spun freely afterwards. However, there are other components inside of a turbo that could have possibly failed and fed that little piece of metal that maybe came from the turbo and then up through the charge pipe, in through the intake manifold, if it could pass somehow through that core, then into the heads, through the valves, and into the piston. I'm not saying that it was the turbo that failed, but after all that happened, we pulled the turbo out, made sure the fins were good, looked at the turbo, it spun freely, everything was fine, and then sent it back to the turbo company to get a new turbo. So was it something inside of the turbo? Again, I don't know, but that's a possibility. The fact that the turbo had seized momentarily is a big sign that something either inside that, part of that, might have had something to do with a part flowing up through the charge pipe, in through the intake manifold, and causing that whole issue inside of the head. So who knows? This little homie right here, where did he come from? We don't really know. I don't know what it is. It's literally just a small, tiny piece of metal. It could have been something else before it took this form. It could have been, like I said, it could have been something that was dropped into the intake, but then it would have to travel through the turbo, into the charge pipe, into the throttle body, into the intake manifold. Now this is where it gets tricky. In the intake manifold, you obviously have your intercooler core. I was looking at my old intake manifold and trying to see if there is an actual way for anything like this to pass through that intake manifold. Are there gaps in the top or bottom from that core? From what I could tell, it seemed like there was a gap on the bottom, but I couldn't really get a good enough look at it. I would probably have to take the entire intake manifold apart to see. So was it something that happened over there? I don't know. We did look at the valve train in the old head. Everything looked completely fine. There was nothing broken. So I don't think it came from anything in there. It didn't come from the spark plugs. All of the spark plugs were completely fine when we pulled them out. Obviously did not come from the old coil packs or anything like that. The high pressure fuel pump was never damaged. Nothing came from that. This is actually the stage 2 high pressure Dorch fuel pump. The same one that I had on that engine when it went out, same one on this engine, and it works completely fine. Could it have been something internally on the core of the intercooler? Maybe that something broke inside of there and sucked it in. This part of this whole ordeal is completely up to speculation because honestly, I don't know what this is, and we don't know how it made its way through. But maybe you guys can chime in. Have you dissected the inside of these intake manifolds? Is there a way for something like this to get all the way through here? Now, if you guys remember also, another significant factor to this whole thing is my turbo had momentarily seized when all of this happened. Now, remember back to where I just said that we could have potentially lost oil pressure from that oil pump, from that back little plastic piece being broken off. The seal was also a bit deformed on the back of that plastic piece. It's possible that we lost oil pressure and that the turbo seized from that. It's possible that this little guy somehow made its way through that turbocharger and locked up the charger momentarily. Now, we were able to free up the turbo. It spun just fine in the car and out of the car. We did end up sending that turbo back and just having them send us a new one anyways, just to be safe. So the real question is, where did this little buddy come from? What's most important, you guys, here is that everything that we took away from it, all that we learned about it, and the fact that I had a team of guys who were dedicated to getting my car, as soon as I got them the motor, back on the road as soon as possible. From the day that that happened 3 weeks later, mind you, these are over Christmas holidays, New Year's, all that, 3 weeks later, we had this car back on the road. And here we are today with a very, very strong running 340. I don't know. I hope this gives you guys some answers. I mean, I get a lot of people asking what happened. I thought for sure that the inside of the oil pump would have been just demolished and that would have been it, and that we weren't getting enough pressure and that caused some issues, but that wasn't the case. I mean, maybe with that little piece that was broken, it could have partially been responsible for some of it, but wherever that little piece came from, that was the culprit. I'll be honest, I haven't done a ton of research on the stock B58 intake manifold and how it's actually designed. I didn't take apart the old one or anything. We just used flashlights and looked in there to make sure that nothing visibly was damaged. But the biggest question I have is, you know, is it possible for a little piece of metal that size to travel all the way through the intake, into the turbo, up the charge pipe, into the throttle body, into the intake manifold, through underneath on top of the core, maybe, that's the part where it gets iffy, into the head, through the valves, into the cylinder, slapping the piston against the head. So it took a while to make this video, guys, because honestly, I didn't want to come at you without some actual facts and like showing you what happened. I wanted to be certain that this was the case, and today we got that answer, so I feel a lot better about it. We can finally lay all this to bed. But before I let you guys go, I also want to touch on the fact that I think that video scared a lot of people when it came to like the B58 engines. You know, I would get a lot of messages like, oh my God, like, is this gonna happen to my car now? I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I want to reassure you that these still are incredible engines and they are extremely reliable. I think this whole situation was obviously just tragic, and who knows, like sometimes you just get really unlucky and someone, who knows, makes a mistake or something fails inside and this happens. It's life. I mean, I'm past it already. I've already moved on past it. I have a fantastic running vehicle now. I'm not living in the past on it. But I don't want you guys to be scared. I don't want you guys to be nervous about buying a B58 powered car. I don't want you to think that, oh my God, they're suddenly unreliable, because they're not. Look at the history of B58 engines. They're not unreliable. If you guys take care of them right and you do things the right way, your B58 will be perfectly fine. But with that being said, you guys, if you're going to be modifying cars to this extent that we do, you have to be willing to accept the responsibilities of what might happen. I'm very fortunate and grateful to be in a position where I could take care of it almost immediately when it did happen. But I know that there's also a lot of people out there that can't, and they take these gambles and they're like, oh my God, I blew my engine doing this or running meth or whatever, and then they're just kind of screwed and out of a car. And just remember, if you're going to be modifying a car, like, make sure you have enough money in the bank to take care of that car if something happens. Now, a lot of people ask me like, oh my God, are you gonna like full send it with a 340? Are you gonna take it so much further? I don't really see a need to take this car performance-wise any further. It's making 620 wheel horsepower on a street-driven 340. I don't care about being the fastest guy. That is not my concern. That's never been the point of like this channel, is to be the fastest. I just have fun modifying these cars, and a 620 wheel horsepower 340 street car is plenty for me. I enjoy this car where it's at, and I also think with the modifications that this has and the way that this car is set up, it's a very, very good sweet spot without going too far. I don't need to do anything to the transmission. Everything is happy. It drives well. It makes good power. I've got multiple maps for different types of driving styles. I just don't see the need to turn it up. If I wanted to do something like that, I would buy something that was strictly a project car. If I blew the engine on it, blew the trans, ripped the axles in half, blew the drive shaft, it wouldn't matter to me because it was a project car. That's also the same way that I look at the E36. When shit happens to it, I'm like, Oh well, we'll fix it in time and it'll be back on the road whenever we can get to it. But this car is like in that sweet spot. It's not quite a project car, but it's still my street car that I like to drive as often as possible. I just don't see the need going any further on it in terms of performance. I think it performs perfectly. I don't think there's anything else you really need to do to this. If I were to change anything on the car, it would probably be a built drive shaft and possibly built axles, but even at that rate, you know, I'm not at the drag strip every weekend ripping this thing. I'm not too concerned about it. But that is really just the only point that I want to drive home to you guys. You know, if you're gonna be doing this, and you're gonna be playing this game, you have to be willing to accept the responsibilities regardless of what happens. It is your car. You decided to be the fast boy. So you gotta take responsibility for that. But again, I don't wanna like scare you guys. So yeah, I'm not gonna drag this on any further. Our little pal Metal here is the reason, however he got in there, however he decided to live in cylinder 3, he is the reason that we had that unfortunate incident with the motor. Anyways guys, I hope this answered some questions. I know there was just so many people asking what happened, but hopefully this answered some questions to you guys. And of course, if you guys wanna comment down below and think about where that little guy came from. Did someone drop it in? Who knows? Did it come off my intake manifold? Who knows? Was it able to make its way through the intake manifold? Who knows? Was it something inside of the head? I don't know. I don't think it was something in the valve train. We checked over the valve train, it looked good. That's it, and that's really gonna be the last time that you hear me talk about this because I'm done with it. We're laying that whole video, time, motor, incident to rest. It was tragedy, but it's now over and I'm focusing on bigger and better things. I love you guys, I'll see you in the next one, peace.